Welcome to our English lesson. Today we will practice the phrase, would much rather. This phrase emphasizes a strong preference for one option over another. While speaking, we should stress these words stress rather for a clear choice, stress much for a strong preference. Stress both much and rather to show a very strong preference. Let's get started. Structure. I would much rather stay at home tonight. He would much rather move to a smaller town than live in a busy city. I would much rather travel the world than settle in one place for the rest of my life. I would much rather have flexible hours than a strict 9-to-5 job. I would much rather pay somebody else to do the cleaning than spend my weekend doing it myself. I would much rather wake up early. He would much rather not speak about his personal life. She would much rather not take that job offer, but she needs the money. We would much rather not waste our time on this. He would much rather not go out in the cold weather. Would you much rather vacuum the living room or mop the kitchen floor first? Would you much rather schedule the meeting for today or tomorrow? Would you much rather go grocery shopping now or after lunch? Would you much rather have coffee now or after the meeting? Structure. I would much rather you spoke to the manager directly. I would much rather you helped that old beggar. He would much rather you stayed until the rain stopped. I would much rather you handled the customer complaints personally. I would much rather you looked over the contract carefully. She would much rather you paid her by cash. I would much rather you didn't make promise you can't keep. I would much rather you didn't interrupt while I am speaking. He would much rather she didn't go out so late. I would much rather you didn't depend on them for everything. I would much rather you didn't tell anyone about this. Would she much rather I chose the dress for her? Would he much rather I talked to his family? Would she much rather I didn't call her at this hour? Would she much rather I did make plans after consulting her? Would she much rather I didn't ask about her private life? Structure. We would much rather have cooked at home than paid so much for an average meal. I would much rather have attended the wedding than missed it. I would much rather have brought a jacket than freeze in the cold weather. He would much rather have visited his grandparents than stayed home. I would much rather have spent my birthday with close friends than celebrated it alone. I would much rather not have eaten that expired food. I would much rather not have stayed in that uncomfortable hotel. I would much rather not have wasted my time on that project. I would much rather not have eaten that spicy food last night. He would much rather not have taken that stressful job. Would he much rather have come with us? Wouldn't she much rather have asked than remained confused about the situation? Would she much rather have taken that job instead of pursuing her studies? Wouldn't he much rather have joined us rather than have sat alone? Structure. I would much rather they had redesigned it. I would much rather we had left for the airport sooner. I would much rather you had invited me to the wedding. She would much rather her parents had supported her decision. I would much rather you had informed me if you were going to be late. I would much rather he hadn't changed the original design. I think they would rather we hadn't come uninvited. I would much rather you hadn't misunderstood me. She would much rather they hadn't interfered in our plans. He would much rather you hadn't shared that information with them. I would much rather you hadn't tried to fix the computer yourself. Would you much rather I hadn't bought something for myself? Would she much rather I had paid the bill? Would he much rather I hadn't accepted the invitation? Thanks for watching.